of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development, conformément à l'article 108 alinéa.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on October 22nd, 2020, the committee is resuming its study on vulnerabilities.
I ask all participants to mute themselves when they're not speaking and to address comments through the chair. And when you have 30 seconds in your questioning or speaking time remaining, I will signal you with this piece of paper. And interpretation, as usual, is available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screens. Before welcoming our witnesses, colleagues, I would like to seek very quickly unanimous consent from members to proceed with the meeting until there are 10 minutes of bells remaining on the vote in order to maximize the committee time with our last panel for this segment of the study. Does the committee give its consent to proceed in that fashion? And the clerk will signal us when there are 10 minutes of bells remaining. Any objections, colleagues? Seeing none, that's carried. Then thank you very much. And
now I would like to welcome our members of the panel.
Mohammed, Human Rights Law and Policy Campaigner with Amnesty International Canada. Paul Champ, a lawyer with Champ and Associates. Alex Camarot.
I apologize. Just sometimes cannot get interpretation. It's coming.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Fonseca. Is interpretation an issue for anybody else? Is it fixed now? Do we have interpretation services? Monsieur Bergeron, est-ce que ça va avec? Yes, okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. Thank you, Mr. Fonseca. Alex Camarotos, Executive Director, Defense for Children International, and Jeff Lone, Head of Education with the International Committee of the Red Cross. To get us through maybe 2, perhaps 3 of the opening remarks, maintenant j'aimerais inviter Monsieur Mohammed.
And now I'd like to invite Mr. Mohammed. And thank you once again for accommodating us. You have the floor for 5 minutes for your opening statement. Mr. Mohammed, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, honorable members, for inviting me to this phase of your study on the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm joining you this afternoon from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa. I would like to focus my remarks on the situation facing 46 Canadian citizens, including some 24 children who are being arbitrarily detained in northeast Syria. I will not spend my time recounting the dire humanitarian situation in Al Hol and Al Roj camps, which is well reported. Instead, I would like to focus the majority of my time discussing how Canadian policy is meant to address instances where a citizen alleges torture or mistreatment in detention abroad. Much of what we know about this policy comes from a 2018 Auditor General's report, as well as this committee's very own study of the topic in November 2018. Global Affairs Canada's policy mandates that consular officials should, quote, promptly advise of the minister in writing of credible information indicating torture and the deputy minister in cases of mistreatment. Prompt is undefined, but a period of 3 months was deemed by the Auditor General to be unacceptable. Responding to this committee's report on the topic, Global Affairs Canada indicated that it was developing timelines for the assessment of torture or mistreatment allegations and the reporting to the minister or deputy minister, respectively. GAC policy further indicates where such concerns arise, a Director General level consular ad hoc working group on torture and mistreatment is to assess whether the allegations are serious and credible and advise the Director General of Consular Operations on the management of those cases. Despite this policy framework, what is known about the application of this policy to Canadians detained in Syria is extremely limited. Amnesty International has been informed that the minister has been advised of allegations of torture and mistreatment in Syria, and that the ad hoc working group has been convened. GAC also reports that it requests updates from Kurdish authorities about the whereabouts and well-being of Canadian citizens in Syria. On the other hand, GAC officials have not indicated whether concrete reporting timelines exist. They will not say how often they receive reports on the health and well-being of these Canadians. And in fact, when Canadian officials met with Kurdish authorities in Sulaymaniyah earlier this year, they specifically did not raise the issue of the detained Canadians. We do not know what advice the ad hoc working group has provided, and Amnesty International's simple request to know when the minister was advised of torture and mistreatment allegations and the outcomes of those assessments was met with a refusal invoking the Privacy Act. Access to information requests about the provision of consular services to the detained Canadians, which specifically exempts the personal consular files, remains unanswered over 1 year after it was submitted. Honorable members, Canada's consular policy framework for torture exists for a reason. It exists because Canadians expect that when they are subject to mistreatment abroad, it will be brought to the highest levels of the Canadian government, investigated, and acted upon. Instead, Canadians who are undoubtedly suffering mistreatment in Syria, including children, have been abandoned by their government. This is the reflection of one detainee shared with me by a Canadian relative. They just finished, 3 guards, beating a woman with the back of their huge guns until she was unconscious and then taken. Maybe she died. Maybe she's in a hospital somewhere. Does anyone care? Nope. We are a group of people forgotten about and left for thugs to do as they please with us. Regrettably, the opacity around the handling of these cases represents a stunning deficit in both transparency and political leadership towards this group of vulnerable Canadians. We have seen admirable initiatives to provide consular services to Canadians across the world during this pandemic, and during the Beirut harbor explosion, and for Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and with respect to Canada's recent initiative on state-to-state arbitrary detention. These Canadians in Syria, by contrast, receive next to nothing. What could be more core to the mandate of GAC's Consular Bureau than the allegations of torture raised by a group of 46 Canadian citizens, especially when the allegations involve Canadian children? What should detainees make from the fact that just last week, this government very commendably announced that it would pursue the Assad regime for crimes of torture committed since 2011, while at the same time, it ignores the plight of its citizens stuck in that country and who are suffering daily human rights violations that Canada is squarely in a position to end? Honorable members, I have 4 recommendations to leave you with, and I see my time is short. First, this committee should demand to know when the minister was made aware of the torture and mistreatment allegations in Northeast Syria and whether those allegations have been deemed substantiated. Second, the committee should insist that the government take every lawful action to end these human rights abuses, ensuring that such action does not discriminate on the basis of gender, political views, or religion, and must respect the rights of the child and the principle of family unity. Third, Canada should work together with the international community to ensure a human rights compliant response for all of those arbitrarily detained in Northeast Syria, regardless of nationality. And finally, Canada should press for accountability for international crimes that may have been committed by these detainees, including by Canadians, in a manner consistent with international human rights law, international criminal law, and international humanitarian law. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Mohammed, thank you very much for your opening remarks. I will now turn the floor over to Mr. Champ. Please go ahead for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Vice Chair, board members of the committee, and thank you for this invitation. I'm a human rights lawyer in Ottawa, and I specialize in constitutional and international law. I have represented many Canadians detained abroad in a variety of different contexts, and that's why I believe I've been invited to speak to you today. I'm also going to discuss the issue that Mr. Mohammed just raised about Syria and the thousands of people that are held in Syria, and in particular, the 25 Canadian children who are being held in the 2 prison camps at Al Hol and Raj. We know there are 64,000 people in those camps, 2/3 of which are children under 12, including those 25 Canadian children. UN investigators have described the conditions in these camps as appalling and inhumane. Some humanitarian services have been actually now scaled back because of COVID. Workers from UNICEF and from MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, have pulled back some of their services because some of their workers have contracted COVID from in the camps. The UN has also reported that many of these children are dying. They're dying from malnutrition, as well as dehydration, diarrhea, and hypoglycemia. And their daily lives could not be more desperate were it not also for the violence in these camps. Exploitation and abuse is rife, and there are people killed by gunfire almost daily. Now, you've heard about some of these dire reports, I know, committee members, but as a lawyer, I want to provide you with a different perspective. I want to advise you that, in my legal opinion, Canada has a duty to take whatever measures are reasonably available to repatriate these Canadian citizens, and especially the children. There can be no dispute that these children are being subjected to serious human rights abuses, such as arbitrary detention, cruel and inhumane treatment, the right to life and security of the person being jeopardized, and also discrimination on a prohibited ground, that is, nationality. And on that last one, the irony is this. While Canada has not yet done anything for these individuals, those children are being detained now because they are Canadian citizens. Thousands of Syrians have been released from these camps, but foreigners and the children of foreigners continue to be held. And here's the tragic point in this. The Syrian Defense Forces want to release these Canadian children. Their condition? They want Canada to take them back. And unless and until Canada does so, they're going to continue to detain them indefinitely in these appalling and dangerous prison camps. Now, Canadian government officials will disagree with my legal opinion that there's a duty on Canada to take action. They will say that the Charter does not extend abroad and does not obligate the government to intervene to assist Canadians abroad in their efforts to leave a foreign country. Now, in most contexts, I would agree with that. But I've been involved in other cases where I've successfully compelled the Canadian government to return Canadian citizens to Canada when they're at risk of serious human rights abuses. And that is the difference. Where Canada knows a citizen abroad is at risk of a serious human rights abuse, such as torture or death, and Canada can take measures, if it's within their power, to diminish or alleviate that risk, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is triggered. Because that's the crucial point in this particular humanitarian crisis. When the SDF says that they will only release these Canadian children if Canada agrees to return them, it is really Canada that holds the keys to those prison camps. It is within Canada's power and therefore their responsibility to repatriate these Canadian children from prison camps in a conflict-affected area. And they will never admit it, I'm sure, publicly. And I see some members perhaps shaking their heads, but I'm sure that some Canadian government officials know that I'm right or believe that I'm right and that Canada's legal duties and the circumstances include repatriating people at risk of serious human rights abuses. I know this and say this because when faced with a lawsuit from a family of an orphan, Elmira, in October, Canada returned her. I'll leave you with this. You can think of this another way. What if China said tomorrow that they would release the two Michaels, but only if Canada would agree to come and retrieve them? Do any of us here doubt that there would be wheels up on a CF plane to China within hours? Yet these children have been waiting years. And let's not forget, the two Michaels, they traveled to China as adults, knowingly. These children are innocent. They did not make the choice to travel to a war zone. Yet it is in a war zone, they are trapped. They are completely innocent, but Canada has the power to return them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Champ. Next is Mr. Camarotos on behalf of Defence for Children International. 5 minutes, please.
Good afternoon. Let me first of all thank you warmly for this invitation to Defence for Children International. A few words about the organization. I think we are the only non-Canadians. Defence for Children International is a leading child rights focused and membership-based grassroots movement currently composed of 35 national sections across 5 continents, created in 1979 during the International Year of the Child in Geneva in Switzerland. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, reported recently to the Human Rights Council here in Geneva in the current session, she said, I quote, "Much of the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been exacerbated by a failure to address previously existing structural causes of inequality, social exclusion and deprivation, and the inability of many countries, rich and poor alike, to meet basic needs of sizable proportion of their populations. This is equally applicable to the children and to the rights of the child, in particular during this pandemic. DCI had the chance to count on some very relevant experiences from other health emergencies, such as the 2015 Ebola emergency in West Africa, where DCI Sierra Leone and DCI Liberia have been particularly involved. Since February 2020, the International Secretariat and the entire movement mobilized in front of this pandemic. Very quickly, we alerted regarding the risk of violations exacerbated by the pandemic or even created by mitigation measures taken by states. In my intervention, in complementarity with other hearings you have had earlier, I wanted to touch upon 2 issues related to children. The first one concerns the impact of the pandemic on violence against children, including gender-based violence. And the second is the impact to access to justice, and in particular to children deprived of liberty. And that touches upon the issue we just heard. UNICEF reported that violence prevention and response services had been disrupted in 104 countries during the COVID pandemic. I believe we still only see the top of the iceberg regarding the impact of the COVID pandemic to violence against children. But what seems to be already well documented is that COVID-19 and some of the mitigation measures taken by the governments have increased the exposure of children to different forms of violence, exacerbating human rights violations such as stigmatization, discrimination, xenophobia, child labor, unpaid work, child pregnancy, harmful acts including child marriage and female genital mutilation, as well on online abuse, bullying, and exploitation. As the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children emphasized in her report in the Human Rights Council earlier this week, what began as a health crisis risks evolving into a broader child rights crisis. The other area for which I wanted to share our experience and results in this area is the justice for children, and particular children deprived of liberty. DCI is in the origin and currently co-chair, together with Human Rights Watch, of a wide civil society coalition on children deprived of liberty, called the NGO Panel for the Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty, composed of 170 civil society organizations worldwide. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, urged authorities since the beginning of the pandemic to look at releasing detainees, and in particular low-risk child offenders. UNICEF data indicate that at least 31 countries have released children from the detention due to concerns about the spread of COVID-19. This is certainly insufficient and even lower than the number of adult detainees released. Honorable members, I cannot finish this very short and certainly incomplete presentation without speaking about the impact of COVID-19 measures in the mental health of children and the importance to ensure a meaningful participation of children on mitigation measures that concern them. DCI organized already last year child and youth-led online debates on the impact of COVID-19 with very, very concrete results. We also participated together with a great number of other civil society organizations to an initiative called COVID Under 19, an initiative to meaningfully involve children in responses to the pandemic, which includes participation from more than 26,000 children from 137 countries. In order to finish, I wanted to quote two of these children who participated in the initiative. First one, a Bolivian girl who said, "I think the government should understand that children are not dumb and easily manipulated. Children should feel trusted and not feel like they have to remain silent. This would increase their confidence and motivate them to report injustice." And last but not least, a Canadian 16-year-old girl who said, "Even though there is a pandemic going on, there are people out there who experience abuse daily. The awareness, even in Canada, and how to access resources is not explained in the best way. Finding that information should be basic knowledge for any human being." I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Camarotos. And we'll now go to Mr. Lone on behalf of the International Committee of the Red Cross for 5 minutes. The floor is yours, sir.
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairs and committee members, on behalf of the International Committee of the Red Cross, I would like to express our gratitude for this opportunity to discuss this extremely important subject. The role of the ICRC is mandated by the international community through the Geneva Conventions, and as such, our exclusively humanitarian role is to support the faithful application of international humanitarian law, and where appropriate, to support the protection and assistance of victims of armed conflict, whilst respecting the core principles of humanity, neutrality, and independence. The impact of COVID-19 on the vulnerability of children in conflict-affected contexts is one which is being felt and witnessed today and throughout the world. And we will certainly see the outcome for years to come. It is a privilege to be able to share some of our own observations over the past 12 months. They must be taken as being only preliminary observations, as the full impact of this pandemic is yet to be felt. I would like to summarize my remarks into the following areas: education, detention, Family Link Services and Recruitment, and Association of Children with Armed Forces and Armed Groups. Education, by its nature, is the public service most vulnerable to shocks, and that came tragically home to us all in the space of a week in March 2020, when nearly 2 billion children in more than 185 countries stopped going to school and schools were closed. While many countries were able to adapt and respond with alternative learning platforms, the technical means is simply unavailable in most of the countries where ICRC is operational. Because of school closure, children have been denied an opportunity to be learners, to make choices for themselves, and for many, a return to school is now precluded. Some have been forced into the workplace, some into early marriage, and some into becoming homemakers. For children who are displaced, refugees, in detention, or simply relying on education as a protective mechanism in a conflict zone, perhaps to avoid recruitment by an armed group, perhaps to be able to eat one meal a day, the long-term impact of this school closure is likely to be catastrophic for the most vulnerable children in the areas where the ICRC works. Lastly, we remain very concerned about the reported increase in the reported levels of domestic violence, including the exposure of children to higher levels than previously recorded. In places of detention, we have seen both positive and negative changes to the status quo. In some contexts, we have witnessed a positive impact of the increased engagement by the authorities to review individual cases. In many different countries, there was an initial rapid release of detainees, often starting with children, as part of the efforts to free up space inside places of detention and reduce the risks of infection for detainees. In some settings, COVID-19 has accelerated a judicial review process where, before, there was no particular urgency to look into the detention of children who may have been awaiting trial, detained without charge, or already served their sentence but had not yet been released. However, on the other side, unfortunately, for those children, and indeed all detainees who remain in detention, COVID-19 has also meant the limitation of family visits, often cutting off valuable lifelines for children who both need and want to maintain contact with their loved ones, and more pragmatically, receive food, clothing, and medicine. Thirdly, COVID-19 across the world has led to the closure of international borders, restricted movements within countries, or limited humanitarian access, including to refugee or IDP camps, to avoid spreading the virus even further. This has had a direct impact on the Family Links services and the Red Cross movement's ability to carry out tracing at the same speed as before, or even simply to put families back in contact, as staff had not had anything like the same access to affected populations to distribute and collect Red Cross messages. Cross-border family reunifications, which involve transferring a family from one country to be reunited with their family in another country, where the ICRC is normally the humanitarian actor in charge of working with the authorities, has been complicated by different and interlinked factors. The border and embassy closures are an administrative hurdle. Accessing the child, which is never straightforward, is made more challenging by ongoing restrictions. Unaccompanied child safety and supervision is problematic when one or several quarantines are necessary. And then sometimes families can be afraid that the incoming child will be seen as bringing the virus into the community and stigmatized or worse. As mentioned earlier, a fourth immediate challenge, and it is too early to have detailed statistics from areas where ICRC works, but it appears that the very worsening socioeconomic situation is driving an increase in early child marriage, particularly so when so many girls are out of school. Several children in one of the countries in the Sahel who were ready to be reunited with their families and whose reunifications were put on standby when the border closed have now refused to return to their families as they married in the interim, clearly as a survival mechanism. In the coming months, it is going to be very important to work with the authorities, other actors, and the Red Cross Restoring Family Links volunteers to ensure that these services can continue and that the unaccompanied, displaced, and migrant children are not exposed to greater risks than they already are. Let us also remember that there were already existing violations of international humanitarian law concerning children that have continued and have been exacerbated. Unfortunately, the recruitment and association of children with armed forces and armed groups continues to expose children to extreme levels of violence, risk, and trauma. In times of socioeconomic hardship, and where school is no longer an option, the push factors for children to join armed groups increase, and because of COVID-19, the authorities may have less access to areas where child recruitment is taking place, and official programs that aim to support children to leave armed groups may be reduced in scope.
Mr. Lone, I wonder if I could stop you there just in the interest of time. We're minutes away from the vote, but I wanted to briefly get colleagues' agreement. We're going to lose about 20 minutes for the vote itself, 10 minutes lead time and 10 minutes for the actual vote. If colleagues would agree to shorten their interventions to 3 minutes, and that we hopefully will get to at least one full round of that. I know the original allotment was 6, but we do have to go into camera for the subsequent discussion. We have a second panel. Is it the agreement of the members that we would proceed in that fashion? Is anybody fiercely opposed to that? It would give every colleague a chance to intervene, but on a much shorter time frame. If there's no objection, we will turn the floor over to Mr. Genuis for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is quite striking that we have a case of Canadian children detained abroad where the captors wish to release them, but the government of Canada is not putting in place the conditions to facilitate that release. Mr. Champ made the observation this would be like if all that was required for the 2 Michaels to be released was for us to go and pick them up, and we failed to do that. Mr. Champ, I think in some ways it's worse than that. It's as if, having received the offer, we had gone, picked up one of the Michaels and left the other behind, because Canada did launch an operation to bring one person out of northern Syria and inexplicably said they couldn't do any more. I would like to ask specifically for your reaction, Mr. Mohammed and Mr. Champ, to the testimony of the previous Foreign Affairs Minister. I raised these issues with Minister Champagne on November 24th before this committee. I asked him why it was possible to repatriate one Canadian child, but not the rest. He said that essentially there was only one Canadian orphan who was in the camp. That's why we could mount a very extraordinary mission to repatriate her. He said we had one orphan and we brought her back. We should all be happy with that. That's a direct quote. We should all be happy with that. I wonder if you had an opportunity to hear the minister's testimony on the 24th, and if you want to react to that part of it or any other part of the minister's testimony on that day. Maybe Mr. Mohammed first and then Mr. Champ.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis, for that. I did have the opportunity to review the former minister's intervention on this point, and can only hope that we will see a change of course. Of course, noting that we have a new minister in place now. Mr. Genuis, in response to your question, I think that is very much apparent that there's no clear articulation. Even the Prime Minister has indicated that the case of the one orphan who was repatriated was exceptional, and I would interrogate what exactly was exceptional about that case. Of course, Amira was an orphan child, but that doesn't change the fact that the other children who are remaining in this camp still have their rights intact, and that the many rights that are under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example, are just as much being violated for the other children who are remaining in that situation as they were for the orphan child. Those, of course, include, for example, Article 3 on the Convention on the Rights of the Child to act within their best interest, Article 8 with respect to nationality and identity, and Article 9 with respect to separation without, to be separated from parents without will. And those are the considerations that we think should be guiding any future efforts that the government of Canada should be taking on this.
Thank you. Just Mr. Champ, very briefly, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
I agree with everything that Mr. Mohammed said. I would just say, for myself personally, as an international human rights lawyer, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of Canada's response to this situation. The flimsy arguments that Canada used to put forward that they simply couldn't do it and it wasn't possible. Well, we know that was just a flimsy argument because they did it for one child, and how they could do it for one child and not others, I don't know if there's ever any kind of rational response to that that's satisfactory to anyone. It's certainly not satisfactory to me and other human rights advocates.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genuis. The floor goes to Mr. Fonseca.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first questions to Mr. Camaratos. The DCI released comments on the children's rights in the digital environment in November 2020. Many recommendations were made by your organization. And how can Canada effectively attempt to create due diligence procedures to protect children from business enterprise? Mr. Camaratos?
Can I take the floor?
Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Yes. So regarding this issue, this is indeed something quite new, because the general comment of the UN CRC has been adopted recently during the COVID period, and it's indeed something that member states, including Canada, have to work very closely. As you mentioned, the complexity of this is that it doesn't only depend on public measures, but also on private companies. And on this, I think that parliaments should adopt, and there is good practices in other countries, legislation putting the limits, and also how they could implement the recommendations of the General Comment 25. So that's for the moment, but I think we are going to work closely. If you permit, I wanted also to add something on the previous questions, although I was not requested, but just to mention that the DCI has been in a group which is called Child Justice Advocacy Group, working specifically on cases like the one we have been discussing. And there is a paper which I will put in the disposal of the clerk to distribute with the members who are interested, with a position paper called "They Are Children, Not Terrorists."
Thank you, Mr. Camaratos. Thank you. And my next question is to Mr. Lone. Mr. Lone, back in September of 2020, the ICRC posted an article about protecting education from attack during the COVID-19 pandemic. A call was made to assist in reestablishment of education facilities during attacks. How was that call being answered during the pandemic?
I think the challenge during the pandemic has been the closure of schools globally. And it is only in erratic circumstances that these schools have been opened in the places where we work. I think that there has been a positive response in limited contexts in war zones where governments and authorities, non-state authorities as well, have taken decisions to protect schools and to withdraw soldiers from the use of schools. And we look forward to that being continued and to be an intensification of the separation of military roles from the role of education.
Mr. Chair, time?
That is pretty much your time, Mr. Fonseca. We're just minutes away from the 10-minute mark that we had agreed to. I would propose, instead of asking Mr. Bergeron to do only a portion of his testimony, that when we resume, give him the floor for his 3-minute round, and then followed by Ms. McPherson. If that's agreeable to the committee, then we would adjourn. We would suspend now for the vote. The lead time still being 10 minutes. The actual vote will lose about 20 minutes, and then we'll resume with 2 rounds of questions to follow before going into camera for our second part of the meeting. If that's agreeable, then let's proceed in that fashion.
Mr. Chair,
yes,
can I
please.
ask a quick question? Is it possible for us to vote on using our new application, and then once everyone in the committee has completed their vote, would it be possible to come back?
I believe that's possible, except the unanimous consent is usually aimed at waiting for the completion of the vote. Madam Clerk, can we agree to resume once everybody's voted? I mean, there may be technical issues that would force members to then re-identify in the plenary if there's issues with their votes. I'm reluctant to do it that way. But Madam Clerk, have you got thoughts on that?
I will take your leadership.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. Let's suspend then until Mr. Oliphant. Yes.
Sorry. On that, as I think our vote could be null and void if we leave the chamber, virtual or not, before the results are announced. So I don't think that I don't think that would be correct. You might want to have the table check on that, but we have to stay in the room physically till it's announced. So I think we would have to stay virtually available.
I think that makes good sense, and that's the safest way to proceed. Dr. Fry, on this point of order?
Yes, I was going to say what Rob said. I think that it is important that we stick to the procedural rules for voting. It doesn't change just because we're at committee. And you've got to be there for the reading of the motion of the vote, and then you've got to be there until the count is finished.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Fry. And colleagues, with that, we'll suspend until the completion of the vote. And thank you. was Monsieur Bergeron. La parole est à vous, monsieur.
May I begin with a point of order? Yes, go ahead. First, I would like to know, could we have a more direct view rather than my Greek profile? Mr. Chair, are we envisaging resuming the debate on Mr. Harris's motion? Because if it's the case, I would have amendments. Would I have to send those in advance to the clerk, or would I do that once we resume our work on Mr. Harris's motion?
On that, I would encourage you not to do it now, just in the interest of time, but there's a possibility to do this in committee business later. Madam Clerk, would that work?
Mr. Chair, it would depend on if the committee agrees to resume debate in today's meeting. Mais pour les amendements,
for the amendments, if you have a written version, once you have an opportunity to present those in committee, I would appreciate to have those in writing. I do have them with me and I could submit those. And I do not want to detain the work of the committee any further, so I'll move into my questions, if you agree, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I think I've understood that from Mr. Camaratos, in answer to Mr. Fonseca's question, that he would have liked to add something further. So I would be interested in hearing if Mr. Camaratas would like to finish his response. I'd like to give him the opportunity to do so now.
Avec plaisir.
With pleasure. I mentioned on the issue of repatriation of children accused of terrorism or children detained abroad. There's a position paper not only from our association, but a regrouping of NGOs that address justice for children. And the recommendation is clear. The recommendation is repatriation of children. And the Committee on Human Rights in Geneva addressed this issue and has received individual appeals according to Protocol number 3. So this issue could take on international dimensions. I have transmitted this document to the clerk of your committee, and it will be translated and it will be sent to all members of your committee. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Camaratos. I very much liked the analogy given by Mr. Genius. It's as if we were to repatriate one of the two Michaels, we would have left one behind. The question that continues to trouble me is, why do you think the Canadian government is refusing to do what other countries have done? Even though they didn't have any representation on site, they have repatriated children from northern Syria. Would one of our witnesses like to answer my question? Or is the interpretation still lagging behind?
Wasn't sure who it was directed at. I guess I could take a crack at it. It's very difficult to answer, quite frankly. I've been involved in this issue since very early. I was representing an individual who was detained in one of those camps in early 2018. And there was a great deal of engagement on the issue at that time by Foreign Affairs. And it did appear that they were trying to repatriate, but I don't know what's changed since then. And I don't know why Canada's policy has changed. It's deeply disappointing. And as I said before, I think, for all of us, it's shameful.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Go to the final round of questions for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all our witnesses and apologize again on behalf of the committee for the break that we did have to take. It was unavoidable, of course, and I certainly would encourage all of the gentlemen who've joined us today to share any additional testimony with the committee so that we can include that into our report, of course, in writing. like all of you and your interventions, I'm deeply concerned about what's happening with detained children in Syria and around the world, of course. And I dare say we all feel grief for what is happening in these situations. I would like each of you very briefly to touch upon what you feel the long-term impacts will be on the children that have been left in the Syrian camp now for so long in such deplorable conditions. And perhaps if I could, I would start with Mr. Champ.
I'm not an expert in such matters, but I think it's easy to understand that children who've been abandoned in those circumstances, aside from the psychological traumas that they are no doubt experiencing today, I question how they will feel when they grow up and find or learn that they were abandoned. So I think it's profoundly traumatic. There's all kinds of studies about children during those sensitive ages and the impact on them. And I don't know how we'll ever explain to those children when they become adults why Canada didn't take action.
Mr. Mohammed?
Like Mr. Champ, unfortunately, I'm not an expert to be able to provide advice in that regard, aside from what logic dictates, and that is, of course, that the serious conditions that they are being subject to, not just physical, but emotionally, one can only expect would have a serious negative and detrimental impact on their development. And that would be cause for concern, but that is very much from a human level based on observations that I think everyone of the committee members and the witnesses can make.
Mr. Camaradas, could I ask you next, please?
Thank you. Just to add that indeed this kind of treatment has a reversible impact to children. And this is now proof, in fact, by a lot of studies of neurosciences that give this argument. And secondly, it is something that it's against also international law, and there have been countries condemned for that. So that's a risk also for Canada, I would say.
And very quickly, Mr. Lone as well, please.
Thank you. We believe and we see that children caught up in these kind of situations globally must be treated as victims first, not as perpetrators. By treating children as victims, we are able to extend the due care and due diligence and responsibility towards them, towards their needs, their complex needs, their growing needs, their emotional needs. And our failure to treat children as victims and are taking another view on them risks changes to the way they will view the world and how they will behave as adults. And we need to be very mindful of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. And I, on our collective behalf, would like to thank our witnesses for their expertise, their testimony, their work and service this afternoon. And again, our apologies for the interruption through the vote, but we sailed through it quite well, I think. And we had a fulsome discussion, even though it could have been much longer. We will allow you to disconnect. And colleagues, we will also suspend to disconnect and come back in camera in a few minutes. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
you.